Most people will hear something like this and walk away unchanged, not because they didn't understand it, not because they lack the ability, but because they protect the version of themselves that feels safe. That version is familiar, predictable, comfortable, and quietly limiting. It keeps your reactions the same, your decisions the same, your life moving in circles that feel like progress, but lead nowhere new. The Stoics approached this differently. They didn't focus on becoming something extraordinary overnight. They focused on something far more demanding, mastery over self. Not adding more motivation, not chasing endless improvement, but removing what weakens you. Illusion, dependence, unquestioned patterns. Because a life without control over your own mind will always feel unstable, no matter how much you achieve. And when you begin to notice that, when you start to see the patterns you've been repeating without question, something shifts. Quietly, you realize the problem isn't outside you, it's in what you've been allowing to run automatically. And once you see that clearly, even for a moment, it becomes difficult to ignore. You wake up and without thinking, you step into the same patterns, the same thoughts, the same reactions, the same quiet hesitation that feels natural only because it's been repeated so many times. It feels like choice, but it isn't. It's conditioning. The mind prefers what it already knows, even if what it knows is limiting. There's a quiet efficiency in repetition, and your brain leans toward it because it saves energy. But what saves energy does not always serve you. So you move through the day believing you are deciding, when in reality you are remembering. Remembering how you react, how you speak, how you hold yourself back, not choosing, repeating. When something feels natural, you stop questioning it. You assume it must be right simply because it's familiar. But familiarity is not truth. It's repetition. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." And if those thoughts have been shaped by years of repetition, then your inner world isn't chosen. It's conditioned. You can see it in small moments. A comment shifts your mood. Uncertainty makes you hesitate. Opportunity appears, and your mind responds with doubt before you even act. None of this feels forced. It feels automatic. And that's the problem. The more automatic it is, the less aware you are. And the less aware you are, the less control you have. The Stoics noticed this clearly. Not to remove emotion, but to understand it. Because without awareness, you are not directing your life. You are being carried by it. And being carried can feel comfortable, especially when it matches what you already expect from yourself. But comfort, when left unexamined, becomes a boundary. It defines what you attempt. It limits what you believe is possible. Over time, you don't just repeat actions, you repeat interpretations. You assign meaning the same way, you react the same way, you assume outcomes based on past experiences that may no longer apply, and slowly those interpretations become your reality. Epictetus put it simply, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." That changes everything. Because if your judgments are automatic, your reactions are not free. They are guided by patterns built long before the present moment, and if those patterns remain unexamined, they will continue to shape how you think, how you feel, and how you act, no matter how much your external circumstances change. So the focus shifts, less on what is happening around you and more on what is happening within you. There is a small space before you respond. You rarely notice it, but it's there. And inside that space, that's where control exists. Not control over everything that happens, but control over yourself. The problem is that most people never see that space because their reactions move faster than their awareness. So the familiar response takes over, the same tone, the same behavior, the same internal dialogue. It unfolds so smoothly that it feels like identity. But what feels like identity is often just repetition, practiced long enough to feel permanent. The moment you interrupt that pattern, even slightly, something shifts. It feels unfamiliar at first, slower, less certain, but also more real. You begin to notice what you would normally overlook: the impulse to react, the urge to withdraw, the habit of explaining yourself. And instead of following those impulses immediately, you observe them. That observation creates distance. And in that distance, something becomes clear. You are not the pattern. You are the one observing it. And once you see that, even briefly, you are no longer fully controlled by it. If this way of thinking speaks to you, stay close to it. Not for motivation, but for clarity. Consider subscribing, not just to follow content, but to return to something that challenges you to think more carefully, act more deliberately, and become more aware of the patterns shaping your life. This is where change actually begins, not with a dramatic decision, but with a quiet awareness. The realization that what feels natural is not always what is aligned, that what feels automatic is not always what is chosen. And once you see that clearly, even for a moment, it becomes difficult to return fully to unconscious repetition. Because now you know. You know that your reactions are not fixed. You know that your thoughts are not permanent. You know that your patterns, no matter how ingrained they feel, can be interrupted. And that knowledge creates a subtle shift in how you move. Not outwardly at first, but internally. You begin to pause more, to observe more, to question what you once accepted without thought. And slowly, without force, the cycle begins to loosen. And if your life is built on patterns you didn't consciously choose, then what exactly are you defending when you say, "This is just who I am"? That phrase feels honest, almost grounded, but more often than not, it becomes a quiet shield. It protects habits that have gone unexamined for years. It keeps behavior in place by giving it a name that feels permanent. The moment something is labeled as identity, it becomes harder to question and even harder to change. But identity, when looked at closely, is rarely something solid. It is a collection of repeated decisions, reinforced over time, until they begin to feel automatic. And what feels automatic begins to feel true. There is a subtle comfort in believing that who you are is fixed. It removes responsibility. It explains away hesitation. It justifies limitations without requiring you to confront them. But that comfort comes at a cost, because if you accept your current patterns as permanent, you also accept the outcomes they produce. You accept the same results, the same frustrations, the same internal conflicts. Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." And part of that suffering comes from the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Stories that feel real, but are often built on assumptions that were never tested. When you say, "This is just who I am," what you are often saying is, "This is what I have practiced the most." You have practiced reacting a certain way. You have practiced thinking a certain way. You have practiced avoiding certain actions and repeating others. Over time, that practice becomes second nature. But second nature is not the same as true nature. It is simply familiar. And familiarity has a way of convincing you that change is unnatural, when in reality it is just unfamiliar. The Stoics approached this differently. They did not see character as something to uncover, but something to build. Not something hidden deep inside you, waiting to be discovered, but something formed through consistent, deliberate action. This shifts the entire perspective, because if character is built, then it is also adjustable. It can be refined, strengthened, redirected. But only if you are willing to question what you have been repeating without awareness. That questioning requires honesty, and honesty is rarely comfortable. It means noticing the moments where you default instead of decide. The moments where you hesitate not because you must, but because you are used to it. The moments where you tell yourself a familiar story instead of examining whether it still holds any truth. These moments are easy to ignore because they feel small, but they are not. They are the foundation of everything that follows. Carl Jung expressed this idea with clarity when he said, Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That line cuts through the illusion completely, because once you recognize that your patterns are not random, that they are not inevitable, but learned and repeated, the sense of inevitability begins to disappear. What once felt like fate starts to look like habit, and habits, unlike fate, can be changed. But change does not begin with force. It begins with awareness, the ability to see a pattern as it is happening, not after it has already played out, to catch the thought before it becomes a belief, to notice the impulse before it becomes an action. This requires a level of attention that most people are not used to maintaining, not because it is impossible, but because it has not been practiced. The challenge is that this moment often feels uncomfortable. The familiar response is easier. It requires no effort, no thought. It flows naturally. Choosing differently, on the other hand, feels uncertain. It requires presence. It requires you to act without the reassurance of habit. And because of that, many people return to what they know, even when what they know is limiting. But the more you notice this pattern, the harder it becomes to ignore. You begin to see how often you participate in your own repetition, not because you want to stay the same, but because it has become automatic. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. You realize that you are not simply experiencing these patterns, you are reinforcing them. This realization is not meant to create guilt, it is meant to create clarity. Because when you see your role in maintaining a pattern, you also see your ability to interrupt it. You are no longer just reacting, you are participating, and participation can be changed. The Stoics believed that control begins within, not in the sense of controlling everything, but in the sense of directing your own responses. This does not mean suppressing emotion or denying difficulty. It means recognizing that between what happens and how you respond, there is space, and within that space, there is freedom. Over time, as you continue to observe and adjust, something subtle begins to happen. The patterns that once felt automatic start to lose their grip. Not all at once, but gradually. You begin to respond with more intention. You begin to think with more clarity. You begin to act with more awareness. And these small shifts begin to accumulate. The phrase, "This is just who I am," starts to lose its hold. Not because you reject yourself, but because you understand yourself more clearly. You see that who you are is not a fixed point, but a process, a series of decisions repeated over time. And if those decisions can be repeated, they can also be changed. This is where real transformation begins. Not with a dramatic reinvention, but with a quiet refusal to continue repeating what no longer serves you. A willingness to pause, to observe, and to choose differently, even when it feels unfamiliar. Because unfamiliar does not mean wrong, it often means new. Because what feels natural is not always what is aligned with growth. It is simply what has been practiced the most. Your mind is designed to favor efficiency, and efficiency comes from repetition. The more you repeat something, the easier it becomes. Eventually, it requires almost no effort at all. That ease creates a sense of correctness, even when the pattern itself is limiting. So when you interrupt that pattern, when you choose something different, your mind resists. Not because the new action is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. This is where most people stop. They interpret that resistance as a boundary instead of a signal that they are stepping outside of automatic behavior, a signal that something new is being introduced. But unfamiliarity feels unstable, and instability is often avoided, so they return to what they know, the same reaction, the same hesitation, the same internal dialogue. And with that return, the pattern is reinforced once again. The Stoics approached this moment with a different understanding. They did not see discomfort as something to escape, but as something to examine. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." That principle is simple, but its application is not. Because in the moment of discomfort, what is right and what is familiar often feel like two different things. The familiar response is easy. It requires no pause, no reflection. But the right response, the one aligned with intention, often requires you to go against what feels automatic. And that is where the real work begins, not in grand decisions or dramatic changes, but in these small, quiet moments where you choose differently, where you feel the pull of habit and decide not to follow it, where you notice the urge to react and allow it to pass without acting on it. These moments are subtle, but they are powerful, because each time you interrupt a pattern, you weaken its hold. At first, this feels uncomfortable. There is a sense of uncertainty, a lack of confidence in the new response. You may feel slower, less certain, less fluid. But that is only because you are no longer operating on autopilot. You are present, and presence requires effort, especially when it is not yet familiar. But over time, that effort begins to shift. What once felt unnatural starts to feel intentional. What once required focus begins to flow more easily. Epictetus captured this process with clarity when he said, "No great thing is created suddenly. That includes the ability to act with intention instead of habit. It is built gradually through repetition of a different kind. Not repetition of unconscious patterns, but repetition of conscious choices. Each time you pause instead of reacting, each time you choose differently despite discomfort, you are creating a new pattern. And like any pattern, it strengthens with practice. But this requires patience. Because the old patterns do not disappear immediately, they remain ready to take over the moment your awareness fades. And there will be moments when you return to them, when you react the way you always have, when you follow the familiar path without thinking. That does not mean the process has failed. It means the process is still ongoing. So the goal is not perfection, it is awareness. The ability to notice when you are acting out of habit and when you are acting out of choice. The ability to recognize discomfort, not as a threat, but as a signal that you are stepping into something new. Because growth rarely feels comfortable in the moment. It feels uncertain, sometimes even awkward. But that discomfort is temporary. What is permanent is the direction you are moving in. When you begin to understand this, your relationship with discomfort changes. It is no longer something to avoid, but something to observe, something to move through rather than away from. You start to see it as part of the process, not a deviation from it. And with that shift, your actions begin to change. You become less reactive, more deliberate. You pause more often, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. You give yourself the space to choose, rather than being carried by impulse. And in that space, you begin to experience a different kind of control. Not control over everything that happens, but control over how you respond. That control is subtle, but it is powerful. It allows you to act with intention, even when the situation is uncertain. It allows you to remain steady, even when discomfort arises. And over time, it reshapes the way you move through the world. Not in a dramatic or visible way, but in a quiet, consistent shift that changes everything beneath the surface. And once you experience that shift, even briefly, it becomes difficult to return fully to unconscious repetition. Because now you know that the discomfort you once avoided was not a barrier, it was an entry point. Which leads to something most people never question: why your behavior shifts depending on who is in front of you. The change is subtle, almost invisible. Your tone adjusts, your posture shifts, your words become more careful or more exaggerated depending on the environment. You don't consciously decide to do this. It happens automatically, shaped by years of social conditioning. The need to be accepted, understood, or simply not rejected begins to guide your expression. And because it feels normal, you rarely stop to examine it. But every adjustment, no matter how small, is a negotiation between who you are and who you think you need to be in that moment. At first, this seems harmless. Adapting is often seen as a social skill, something necessary for connection, and in many cases it is. But there is a difference between awareness and unconscious performance. When adaptation becomes automatic, it starts to override intention. You begin to say things you don't fully mean, hold back thoughts that might be valuable, or present a version of yourself that feels easier for others to accept. Over time, this creates a quiet fragmentation. You become slightly different in each environment, adjusting just enough to maintain comfort, but not enough to remain fully aligned. This is where control begins to slip, not in a dramatic way, but in a gradual one. Because the more your behavior is shaped by external expectations, the less it is guided by internal clarity. You start to rely on cues from others to determine how you should act, what you should say, and even how you should feel. And without realizing it, your sense of self becomes flexible in a way that weakens it. Not because flexibility itself is a problem, but because it is no longer directed by choice. It is directed by circumstance. The Stoics paid close attention to this. They valued consistency, not as a rigid rule, but as a reflection of inner alignment. A person who is guided by clear principles does not need to adjust their core behavior depending on who is present. They may express themselves differently in different situations, but the foundation remains the same. Seneca once wrote, "No man was ever wise by chance." Wisdom, in this sense, is not accidental. It is built through deliberate attention to how you think, how you act, and why you choose one response over another. Without that attention, behavior becomes reactive, shaped by whatever environment you happen to be in. There is a subtle pressure in every interaction. It is not spoken, but it is felt. Expectations form quickly. People categorize, interpret, and respond based on what they perceive. And in response to that, you adjust. You become slightly more agreeable, slightly more reserved, slightly more expressive, whatever fits the moment. But each adjustment, when done without awareness, reinforces the idea that your behavior should be shaped by external feedback rather than internal direction. Over time, this creates a pattern. You begin to anticipate how others expect you to act, and you meet that expectation before it is even expressed. It feels smooth, almost efficient, but it comes at a cost. Because the more predictable you become, the easier it is for others to understand you, and the easier it is to influence you. Not necessarily in a manipulative way, but in a subtle one. Your reactions become expected, your responses become familiar. And familiarity, while comfortable, reduces your ability to act freely. Carl Jung touched on this dynamic when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That idea is often misunderstood. It does not mean uncovering a fixed identity hidden beneath layers of experience. It means moving toward a state where your actions are aligned with your awareness, rather than shaped by unconscious patterns or external pressure. But that movement requires you to notice where you are performing instead of expressing. Performance is not always obvious. It does not always feel artificial. In fact, it often feels natural because it has been practiced for so long. But there is a difference between what feels natural and what is chosen. The more you observe your behavior in different environments, the more you begin to see the shifts. The slight changes in tone, the adjustments in language, the hesitation before speaking certain thoughts. These are small signals, but they point to something deeper. The question is not whether you should adapt at all. Adaptation, when done consciously, can be useful. The question is whether that adaptation is guided by intention or driven by the need for acceptance. Because when acceptance becomes the priority, clarity begins to fade. You start to filter yourself, not based on what is true or necessary, but based on what is likely to be received well. And in doing so, you move further away from consistency. Consistency, in the Stoic sense, is not about being the same in every situation in a rigid way. It is about maintaining alignment with your principles regardless of the situation. It is about knowing what you value and allowing that to guide your behavior, rather than adjusting those values to fit the moment. This kind of consistency creates stability, not just in how others perceive you, but in how you experience yourself. When you begin to shift in this direction, something changes. You feel less need to adjust unnecessarily. You speak more directly, not aggressively, but clearly. You act with more intention, not based on immediate feedback, but on what you have already decided matters. This does not always make interactions easier. In fact, it can create moments of discomfort, especially when others expect a certain version of you. But that discomfort is temporary. What remains is a stronger sense of control. And control, in this context, is not about dominating situations or influencing others. It is about maintaining alignment within yourself, the ability to act in a way that reflects your awareness rather than your conditioning, the ability to remain steady even when the environment changes. This kind of control is quiet, but it is powerful. Over time, as you continue to observe and adjust, the need to perform begins to fade. Not completely, but significantly. You become more consistent, not because you force it, but because you understand what guides you. And that understanding reduces the influence of external expectations. You are no longer reacting to what is around you. You are responding from within. This shift is not immediate. It develops gradually through repeated moments of awareness and deliberate choice. But once it begins, it changes how you move through every interaction. Not in a way that is obvious to others, but in a way that is clear to you. And that clarity becomes the foundation for everything that follows. The Stoics recognized this as one of the primary sources of internal instability, not because they believed goals or relationships should be avoided, but because they understood the risk of attaching your sense of control to things that are inherently unpredictable. Epictetus expressed this clearly when he said, "Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens." That principle is simple, but it requires discipline, because it asks you to separate what you can influence from what you cannot, and to place your focus entirely on the former. But that separation is not easy. The mind naturally extends beyond what it controls. It anticipates, it expects, it imagines outcomes, and begins to emotionally invest in them before they occur. That investment creates a sense of ownership over results that have not yet happened. And when those results fail to align with expectation, the reaction is immediate. Not because the situation itself is overwhelming, but because the attachment has already shaped your response. This is where behavior becomes reactive. You begin to chase certain outcomes, not because they are aligned with your values, but because you are attached to the feeling they promise. You seek validation, not because it is necessary, but because you have linked it to your sense of worth. You try to control how others perceive you, not because it changes your reality, but because it influences how you feel about yourself. And in doing so, your actions become dependent on variables you do not control. There is a subtle shift that happens when you begin to see this clearly. You realize that the issue is not the external situation, but the internal dependence on it. Seneca once wrote, "He who is brave is free." Courage in this context is not about external action. It is about internal independence, the ability to act without being controlled by the need for a specific outcome, the ability to remain steady even when things do not go as planned. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you change the way you care. You engage fully in what you are doing, but you do not attach your stability to how it turns out. You put effort into your actions, but you do not measure your value based on the result. You speak clearly, but you do not depend on being understood in a particular way. This creates a different kind of presence, one that is not driven by need, but by intention. At first, this feels unfamiliar. There is a sense of letting go that can feel like losing control, even though it is the opposite. Because when you release attachment to outcomes, you are not becoming passive. You are becoming focused. Your attention is no longer divided between action and expectation. It is fully directed toward what you can influence in the moment, and that clarity improves the quality of your decisions. You begin to notice how much energy was previously spent on things that never fully belonged to you. Worry about how something will turn out. Concern about how others will respond. The constant adjustment based on imagined reactions. When that energy is no longer invested in external uncertainty, it becomes available for something else, for presence, for clarity, for deliberate action. This shift changes the way you experience challenges. When something does not go as expected, the reaction is different. There is still awareness, still evaluation, but less emotional disruption, because the outcome was never fully under your control to begin with. What remains under your control is how you respond, how you adjust, and how you continue forward. And that is where stability is built. This does not remove uncertainty from life, it changes your relationship with it. Instead of trying to eliminate it, you learn to move within it without losing your center. You act, you adjust, you continue, but your stability remains anchored within your own decisions rather than external results. And as this becomes more familiar, something else becomes clear. The need for constant validation begins to fade. Not because validation disappears, but because it no longer holds the same influence. It becomes information, not a requirement. You can receive it without depending on it. You can move without waiting for it. And that independence allows you to act with a level of clarity that was not available before. This is where intention replaces need, where action is guided by choice rather than expectation. And in that shift, much of the internal tension that once shaped your behavior begins to dissolve. Not completely, but significantly enough to change the way you move through every situation. So if your reactions are no longer automatic, and your stability is no longer tied to outcomes, something begins to change in the way you move through the world. It is not loud. It is not something others immediately notice, but internally there is a shift. You become quieter, not because you have less to say, but because you feel less need to say it. There is less urgency to explain yourself, less pressure to announce what you are about to do, less desire to turn every intention into words. And that quiet is not emptiness. It is control. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. You are used to filling space, used to expressing thoughts as they arise, used to clarifying your position so that others understand you. But as your awareness deepens, you begin to see how much of that expression was unnecessary, not harmful, but excessive. Words used to manage perception, to maintain connection, to seek acknowledgement. And once you see that clearly, something begins to fall away. You start to speak less, but with more precision. You begin to choose your words rather than release them automatically. This is not about becoming distant or unapproachable. It is about becoming intentional. There is a difference between silence that comes from avoidance and silence that comes from clarity. One is driven by fear, the other by control. When you are clear on what matters, you no longer feel the need to constantly express it. It is reflected in your actions instead. The Stoics understood the weight of unnecessary speech, not because speaking is wrong, but because unfiltered expression weakens focus. Epictetus once said, "Be mostly silent, or speak only what is necessary and in few words." That idea is not about restriction for its own sake. It is about preserving attention. Every word you speak directs energy. It shapes how others perceive you, but more importantly, it shapes how you experience yourself. The more you speak without intention, the more scattered that energy becomes. And when your energy is scattered, your direction becomes less clear. You begin to divide your focus between doing and explaining, between acting and presenting. You talk about what you plan to do, what you are thinking about doing, what you might do. And in that process, something subtle happens. The act of speaking creates a sense of progress, even when no action has been taken. It gives the illusion of movement without the substance of it. But when you begin to hold your intentions more quietly, something shifts. You remove that illusion. You no longer rely on words to create a sense of advancement. The only thing that produces that feeling is actual movement. And that changes your relationship with action. It becomes more direct, more grounded. You begin to build without needing to announce that you are building. This also changes how others interact with you. When you stop explaining every decision, stop revealing every thought, there is less for others to interpret, less for them to influence. Not because you are hiding, but because you are no longer offering unnecessary access. Your actions become clearer than your words, and that clarity creates a different kind of presence, one that is harder to define, but easier to respect. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be one." That principle applies here with precision. The more you speak about your intentions, the more you remain in the realm of discussion. The moment you reduce that discussion and move into action, the need for explanation disappears. You are no longer describing a direction, you are following it. There is a certain discipline required to maintain this. The urge to speak does not disappear completely. There will be moments where you feel the need to share, to clarify, to express. And in some cases, that is appropriate. But the difference is that now it is a choice, not a reflex. You can recognize the impulse and decide whether it serves a purpose or not. Over time, this creates a more focused way of moving. Your attention is less divided, your energy is more concentrated. You spend less time managing perception and more time developing substance. And that shift, though quiet, is significant, because substance builds steadily, even when it is not visible. There is also a certain protection in this approach, not in a defensive sense, but in a practical one. The more you expose your intentions early, the more you open them to external influence. Opinions, doubts, expectations, these begin to shape your thinking before your actions have fully formed, and that can slow progress, sometimes without you even realizing it. When you move more quietly, you give your actions space to develop without interference. You allow your ideas to take form without being diluted by external input, and by the time you reveal them, they are no longer fragile. They are established. That difference changes how they are received, but more importantly, it changes how they are executed. This is not about isolation, it is about selection, choosing what to share, when to share it, and why, not out of secrecy, but out of intention. And that intention strengthens your ability to move forward without distraction. As this becomes more natural, the need for recognition begins to fade as well, not completely, but significantly. You no longer rely on acknowledgement to validate your progress. The work itself becomes enough. The movement itself becomes the confirmation, and that independence removes a layer of pressure that often goes unnoticed. You begin to act because it aligns with your direction, not because it will be seen or understood by others. And in that shift, your actions become more consistent, less influenced by external response, more guided by internal clarity. This kind of quiet discipline does not draw attention immediately. It does not announce itself, but over time it becomes evident, not through words, but through results. Through the way you carry yourself, the way you respond, the way you move with less hesitation and more intention. And once you experience that, even briefly, it becomes difficult to return to the need for constant expression, because you realize that clarity does not need to be spoken repeatedly, it needs to be lived. And when you remove the need to be seen, something else begins to take shape, something quieter but far more stable. Discipline that no longer depends on attention. It is not fueled by recognition or reinforced by external praise. It exists whether anyone is watching or not. At first, this kind of discipline feels unfamiliar because most effort is tied in some way to visibility. There is usually an audience, even if it is small, someone to acknowledge progress, someone to notice consistency, someone to validate that movement is happening. But when that disappears, when there is no one observing, the foundation of your effort is revealed. Because without observation, there is nothing to perform for, no image to maintain, no impression to manage, no expectation to meet. What remains is simple and direct. Action or inaction, movement or stagnation. And in that space, there is no room for illusion. You cannot rely on appearance. You cannot substitute effort with explanation. You are left with what you actually do, not what you say you are doing. This is where most people begin to slow down. Not because they lack ability, but because the absence of feedback removes a source of motivation they have become accustomed to. The energy that came from being seen is no longer present, and without it, action feels heavier, more deliberate, less rewarding in the immediate sense. But this is also where something more durable begins to form, because when you continue without recognition, your reasons for acting begin to shift. You are no longer driven by how something looks. You are driven by what it builds. The Stoics practiced this kind of internal discipline deliberately. They understood that external validation is inconsistent. It appears and disappears without warning, and if your effort depends on it, your consistency will fluctuate with it. Seneca once wrote, "What progress, you ask, have I made? I have begun to be a friend to myself." That idea points to something often overlooked. Progress is not always visible from the outside. It is often internal, reflected in the way you think, the way you respond, the way you continue, even when no one is there to acknowledge it. There is a certain honesty in isolation that cannot be replicated in public. When you are alone with your effort, there is no distortion, no adjustment for appearance, no selective presentation. You see clearly what you are doing and what you are not. And that clarity, while sometimes uncomfortable, is necessary. Because without it, it is easy to believe that you are progressing when you are only maintaining the appearance of progress. This is where discipline becomes less about intensity and more about consistency. Not the kind of consistency that is driven by pressure, but the kind that is built through repetition without external reinforcement. You show up, not because it will be seen, but because it matters. You continue, not because it will be recognized, but because it aligns with what you have decided is important. At first, this feels quiet, almost unnoticed. But over time, it builds something solid, a form of reliability within yourself. You begin to trust your own actions, not because they are visible, but because they are consistent. That trust changes how you approach everything. You rely less on external structure and more on internal direction. There is also a certain resistance that develops, not resistance to difficulty, but resistance to distraction. When you are not performing for an audience, there is less incentive to shift your behavior based on external input. You are less influenced by what others are doing, less affected by comparison, less drawn into unnecessary adjustment. Your focus becomes narrower, but also sharper. Carl Jung expressed this shift with depth when he said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." That awakening is not dramatic. It does not happen all at once. It develops gradually, through repeated moments of attention, directed inward rather than outward. You begin to observe your own patterns more closely. You notice where you are consistent and where you are not. And instead of adjusting based on how it appears, you adjust based on what is real. This inward focus is not about isolation from others. It is about independence from constant external influence. You can still engage, still connect, still share. But your foundation is no longer built on how those interactions unfold. It is built on what you do when those interactions are absent. There is a certain strength in that, a quiet confidence that does not rely on recognition. It is not expressed loudly. It does not need to be. It is reflected in consistency, in steadiness, in the ability to continue without interruption. And that kind of strength is difficult to disrupt because it is not dependent on conditions that can change. Over time, this changes how you view effort itself. It is no longer something you display. It is something you refine. You become less concerned with how it is perceived and more focused on how it is executed. And that shift, though subtle, has a significant impact on the quality of your actions. You begin to see that real growth rarely happens in moments of visibility. It happens in repetition, in correction, in quiet persistence. It happens when you continue, even when there is no immediate reward, no acknowledgement, no indication that what you are doing is being noticed. And in that process, you build something that is not easily shaken, because when your discipline is no longer tied to attention, it becomes stable. It continues regardless of circumstance. It adapts without losing direction. And it allows you to move forward with a level of consistency that does not depend on anything outside of your own decisions. And once that becomes familiar, even briefly, the need for external validation begins to lose its influence, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer required. What remains is something quieter, but far more reliable, a discipline that exists whether it is seen or not. Most people will leave this moment and return to what's familiar, not because they have to, but because it's easier. But you don't have to follow that path again. You've seen enough to know that change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from deciding and then acting, even when it feels uncomfortable. If something in you has shifted, even slightly, don't let it fade. Stay with it, build on it, and if you're ready to go deeper, there's another video waiting for you on the screen right now that will take this even further. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal.